Good morning. Welcome to Webinar Wednesday, and let's talk about some mezzanines today. I'm glad everybody could make it with us today. We'll have a couple minutes to chat while everybody starts logging in. But mezzanines has always been an interesting topic. I think the interesting thing about mezzanines is that a lot of things link to other things, and when you have that linkage, you can easily make an error at the beginning, and then that can turn into an error that gets a lot bigger by the end. So that's something when we're talking about mezzanines, we're really going to try to step through the process for everybody so that we can come out of the other end with a good understanding of mezzanines and how they work and how code compliance fits into these intermediate floor areas. So same drill, as this is our last free webinar, we kind of still have a bit of a sales package, and we have a bit of an introductory package as we move into more of our subscription based, which starts at our next webinar. We'll of course have some veterans on our team as we sort of move through all these code issues. But keep in mind that of course we're going to email you the replay video. So if you have to leave early today, or if you would like to look at it a little bit later, of course, the replay is going to be there for you so you can touch up and fine-tune your skills. Ask questions anytime through the Q&A mode. So on your right-hand side, of course, you'll have a chat box. Make sure you pick question and make sure you ask questions throughout the webinar. If we can fit it in during that particular section, then we'll do so. But the more complex items or items that we feel need to wait, will be done at the end of the webinar. And of course, make sure you chat back and forth. We really appreciate the different opinions that we see on the chat box. It gives us an idea of how things are going and if we need to touch base on certain other topics. And of course, we always appreciate other opinions because having great discussions with different opinions helps us articulate our code skills. And of course, share your opinions. We want to know how we're doing. We've been receiving some great response on these webinars and some good comments based on what we should be doing and things that people didn't like. So we've been trying to change the way we approach these as we move forward. Today's cast, the usual crew, that'll be myself. My name is Gerald Moore. I'm the president of RSM Building Consultants, and I've been a building official for over 25 years, working with plans review and inspections, and also chief building official work for municipalities. And of course, with me today is Mandy, the director of plans examination with us. Hi, Mandy.
Good morning.
Mandy does all of the coordination and the technical review with oversight with regards to our plan review division. So she's definitely got a lot of knowledge in this area, and we're glad to have her today. And today she's going to be acting as a bit of a moderator and helping with the questions and giving input on the chatter. Moving forward, starting in 2 weeks, we have our membership for our webinars. This membership will allow you to get 14 subscribed webinars that will go through a series of different technical discussions so that we can have these Wednesday morning discussions on technical items. That's going to fine tune our skills as we move forward, and of course allow us to get CPDP points for anything from OSET to the OAA to, of course, the Ontario Building Officials Association. These rates are $495 per subscribed person. Of course, if you're from a large municipality, please reach out and we can look at some bulk rates. Also, if you're looking at either we can invoice you, but also if you look at our offer tab on the right-hand side, you'll notice there's an offer button, and of course you can click that. It'll take you right to our website, and you can get yourself signed up for moving forward, our new technical discussions. Here are some of the topics we released those last webinars. So these are the discussions that we have coming up on our next webinar series. So these are the discussions that we have. Plus, please give us some thoughts. We have actually quite a few subscribers now already. So we're looking forward to a great season moving forward on these. And these are the technical discussions we're going to have. Plus, there's some other ideas. I'm also in discussions with some other technical personnel in order to give us some other type of training that would deal with some real specific stuff in the building code. What do you get? 7 months of bi-weekly courses, 21 plus hours of technical training, of course, as you're going to get with these the subscription, unlimited replays of all the videos. We're going to have personal PDFs of each class, so we're going to have the PDFs of the presentation, a lot of the roadmaps and stuff that we do, and so that'll help you when you're meandering through these code provisions. They're going to be provided. CPDP points, we are going to be providing them. If you're an OBOA member, we send them directly through. There's nothing that you need to do. For OAA and OSET, we'll be providing you with certificates so that you can self-report to those associations. Our next topic, June 10th, we're going to be talking about truss bracing in roof systems. This is a topic that I've had a bit of experience in, and I've done a bit of research with regards to not just the fact of having these pre-engineered elements, but how does the element of permanent bracing dealt with in the building code, the TPIC guidelines, how is that applied? That is going to be the detailed discussions that we're going to be having in this webinar that's coming up on June 10th. Something you don't want to miss. We're going to be discussing a lot of elements of this system, which we all have dealt with a few problems as we've gone through code compliance with regards to it. After that, we're going to be doing engineered floor systems. Another item that is actually a completely different area than trusses. Although they're engineered elements, there's a lot of differences between these two types of systems when we're dealing with code compliance. So we want to bring these particular issues forward and start discussing these issues on engineered floor systems. So that's another one that we're looking forward to. Collecting your points, I've already discussed this, but for OBOA members, they've been clear with us what they're looking for. Provide us at RSM your OBOA number once, and then we will continuously subscribe for you and submit these points. We have been approved to administer the points for you. Essentially, you get 1 point for an hour. If it's an hour and a half, you get 1.5 points. So that's the way this webinar works with regards to technical provisions and CPDP points with the OBOA. We typically do this poll on our webinars here just to get an idea of our audience, as it does change a little bit as we move forward. And so if you look on the right side of your screen, you'll notice there is a poll button. And in that poll button, you'll be able to answer the question for us to help us understand who we have in the room. Of course, what is your role as a building code practitioner? Building inspector, plans examiner? Are you an architect or technologist, an engineer or engineering technologist, designer, builder, or you fit into your own category? This kind of helps us understand as we're going through these items who we're dealing with, and we are getting some results that we typically get, which is great, except we seem to be getting more plans examiners this time. 54% it looks approximately as we're going through this is building inspectors, 36% is a plans examiner, and then a few percentage points on the remainder. So thanks for coming today. We really appreciate your activity and your attendance today. This is definitely something that helps us move forward with these webinars, and it goes to show that we all do need to discuss this stuff to help ourselves fine-tune those skills as we move forward. And so that's fantastic. So it looks like we're at about 55% building inspector, 36% as a plans examiner.
Gerald, could you just touch on, we've got a question just about what's accessible after these are completed. So could you talk about what the options are for?
Yeah, so through your registration links and through everything that you've been sent through the free, for the next, for the next month or so, you're going to have free access to the replays. I have posted a lot of the YouTubes, a lot of the videos up on YouTube. So if you want to review those through YouTube, you can. They'll be available for a bit of a limited time to help you understand what we do and to remember what this is all about, and to kind of sort of fine-tune your notes. But I think if you're looking for us to for a library that you'll always have, I think what you need to look at is the subscription. Of course, that's what we're here for. And and the resources that we gather helps us maintain that library, and it also helps us maintain and bring you more great content. But definitely for the next few months, you're going to have access through the replay and through YouTube.
Comment here too that there's a good point that a lot of people do both inspection and plans exams. So I think through the poll they can only choose one, Gerald. So
there you go. All right. Okay.
Noted. There's a lot of mixed.
They're declaring themselves as an inspector, I guess. Okay. Well, thanks for that information. That definitely helps. Our next question we always like to ask, of course, as we go through the technical discussion, is how comfortable do you feel working through OBC related issues related to mezzanines? And mezzanines can be tricky, as I discussed at the opening, is that these mezzanines can be tricky based on the fact that they're based on other elements. It's not like you look up one sentence and there's your answer. You have to go through a particular story in order to get to the answer. In order to know how many exits, I need to know if I need a vertical fire separation. How do I know I need a vertical fire separation? Well, I need to know whether it's considered a story. So you have to work through these issues in order. And if you don't, then it can get quite confusing. And so that's why we wanted to do this mezzanine and this topic especially, is because we wanted to try to have a simplistic form as much as we can in the building code. It's not quite that easy sometimes, but we wanted to make sure that we could have some type of system in place, some type of description that we could all have a good discussion on how we apply these particular code issues. So when we're looking at these OBC issues, we've got, not very, I usually follow the new requirements as it is too difficult to follow. Like I have a hard time, somewhat comfortable, but I find it difficult to navigate, and some fairly comfortable. I would like to compare notes, and I got this, and I can provide advice. So it looks like we have a good mix between people, 46% saying fairly comfortable and 36 saying I'm somewhat comfortable. So, and then we have a few people that are not very. So this is great. Let's compare notes together. And I think one of the things that I found, especially through a lot of our mentorship that we do, is a lot of times people will say, well, they'll just want to know that they're doing it right. And they'll just call someone to say, is this the way you're looking at it? And it's like, yeah, I am looking at it. You know what you're talking about. And I think that's important, is that at least if we can compare notes and you can say, this is the way I look at it too, it gives us a lot more confidence as we move through on these code items. So today's agenda. At the beginning, I want to talk about general information about mezzanines. What's the general gist of a mezzanine? How does it fit into the building code? Second section I want to talk about is the types of mezzanines. So what I have done is I've gone through and I've basically categorized these specific types of mezzanines in order for us to understand how they apply to specific items of the building code. I want to talk, of course, about building height, because mezzanines drastically affect this thing called building height. When we're trying to do certain items of the building, it can affect sprinkling of a building. So there's a lot of big impacts on mezzanines. So we're going to talk about that, of course, on this building height. Vertical fire separations. We all love to have open areas, but the gist of the code is that we need to compartmentalize buildings to stop fire movement throughout the building. So this critical vertical fire separation, and whether you need it or you do not need it, is very important when we go through these code items. And of course, the last piece is means of egress. We need to know how many exits, how many means of egress. How do I get off of this mezzanine? Do I treat it like a regular floor area, or do I have special rules with regards to a mezzanine egress? So we're going to touch on all of these items in this particular webinar today so that we can help people understand when they're moving through how they can interpret the way the code lays it all out. So essentially in the building code, it defines what a mezzanine is, and it's an intermediate floor assembly between the floor and the ceiling of any room or story, which includes a balcony. So the idea is it's a partial floor area. And when you're looking at how high a building is for building height, of course, if you have a building, you look at it, you might say, well, that's a 2-story building, because you've got a main floor and a second floor. Well, is that second floor a mezzanine? Well, if it's partial, it's not completely enclosing the entire building, then yes, it is a mezzanine. And then the question becomes, Is this mezzanine a story? And so this is really where you're getting down to the root of mezzanines. And a lot of these, especially industrial buildings, and that's where I find most of us are going to be dealing with mezzanines. Maybe some office buildings and the odd E, but generally speaking, I find it's the industrial buildings, especially floor space is critical in these industrial plants. A lot of times what will happen is they will need to provide more floor space and they can't do an addition. So the best way to do this, of course, is to provide a floor space in between the ceiling and the current floor that you have. And so this is what we'll be dealing with regards to mezzanines. I've had a couple of situations where these car manufacturing plants have come in, and the car manufacturers are very demanding of their parts suppliers. And so we are going to get a lot of these applications for building permits, and they're going to be putting a lot of pressure on building officials and even as the engineers and architects that they have to have it done now, because you have to be able to not only create this mezzanine, but you need to be able to actually show the car manufacturers that you can produce this part in this amount of time before you get the actual job. So there's a lot of pressure. So I find with these mezzanine applications, a lot of times there's a lot of pressure to get these in, especially when you're dealing with large car manufacturing firms. And in my past, I've had one car parts manufacturer that installed this mezzanine right in the middle of this huge plant, and then they kicked themselves into the requirements of having an exit. How the heck are you going to get an exit which goes directly outside when you're in the middle of the plant? So when you don't understand how mezzanines and the code compliance is dealt with, you could get yourself into huge problems with mezzanines. And so I think definitely this is something we really need to have a good understanding of, especially if you get the pressure to review these quickly and move them forward.
I think, Gerald, too, there is a lot of pressure, because how many permits have we done where it was an afterthought? These things are already installed. It was this quick skeleton frame thing that they threw in there, and then they have to deal with the ramifications after. So I find you just get a lot of pushback based on, well, it's kind of already there, so how can we make it compliant? But sometimes that's just not an option.
It is. It's a difficult one, and because of course not to say people are breaking the law, but it's difficult for us to catch them as building officials because they're doing them inside, and there's no sometimes way to see what they're doing. But you're right. It's always a big pressure point, especially when they've been built without a permit. And yeah, we have dealt with a few of those, haven't we?
Yes, we have.
Where alternative solutions, unfortunately, have to come to the table, but sometimes they can't. And so I think this definitely will bring out some of the issues as we move through the content today. When you're dealing with mezzanines, there are three big points that you're really trying to tackle. And it's the things we're going to tackle today. Is that when you have a mezzanine, it's going to affect three items. It's going to affect the building classification, your 322 articles. It's going to affect sprinklering, non-combustible construction for the building, or floor fire separations. So these are big ticket items, huge ticket items. So when we're dealing with the numbers, and let's be honest, the building code is a number game. A group of people sat around a table and decided numbers based on how they felt, based on maybe other codes. The Ontario Building Code and the Canadian Building Code is based on work done many, many years ago. So these has been established by a group of people. And so a lot of times when I see people come in with numbers, and later on I probably will be just refreshing your memory on the open mezzanine and the 40% rule. Well, we can't be 41%. We can't be 40.05. If we're on paper, we need to make these things work with the numbers. Yes, the numbers are just numbers. But when we're dealing with these things, especially when we're dealing with a lawsuit or a liability issue, you're going to be drilled on these numbers, and these numbers have been established. Now, there always is alternative solutions. There's other ways to sort of work through things. I'm not sort of trying to say that we have to be exactly by the numbers, but I think when we're generally working with this stuff, we should deal with the numbers. If there's a reason why it has to be 41% based on this, then a lot of building officials and engineers and designers can work through those items. But I think we generally want to work with the numbers. These numbers have been created. They've been done for many, many years. And there's a lot of people with a lot of technical expertise that have sat around the table and that have dealt with these issues. So the first thing is building classification. And because it's such a big issue, you definitely want to make sure you get it right. Openings through floors. We don't want, generally speaking, in the building code to have open areas through floor systems. If you have a floor system, it's got to be generally a fire separation because we don't want smoke and flame movement from one story to the other. I always think when we talk about fire separation and compartmentalization and passive fire protection in buildings, we want to think of them as like a submarine. The idea is that we can always compartmentalize this like a sub. If you get it flooding, you can compartmentalize that flood section, and it won't bring the whole sub down. Same thing here. We want to compartmentalize our building. So when we have a mezzanine, are we going to be allowed to have it open to below? Critical questions that are all going to be based on the criteria that we've talked about today. All right. Means of egress. That's the next item. So based on these items, we need to know, are we going to be dealing with this means of egress through a regular floor area? Do we just treat it like that? Or do we have special mezzanine rules? And you know, we're going to talk about in the code, especially in the egress section, it's hidden under egress of doors. I've always hated that, but we'll talk about that later. So there is sections specific to mezzanines, and we're going to touch on how we deal with the egress of mezzanines, which can get quite complex as you go through these items. So what I've done is I haven't really touched on the arena and the theater mezzanines, although they are quite similar. The ideas are quite similar. Is when we were going through this presentation, we wanted to try to keep it as concise as possible, and we also wanted to try to deal with what type of mezzanines we're always and most often dealing with. Now, you know, maybe if you're in Stratford, you'll get a few theaters, maybe elsewhere. And, you know, our arenas, you might get the odd arena that comes through. But I imagine we are constantly dealing with industrial and office and possibly mercantile mezzanine. So that's what we really wanted to talk about today, is about this issue of mezzanines in the most critical items we deal with. And I have categorized these based on the way that the code talks about these types. Now we have a regular mezzanine. Why I say regular is because it doesn't meet any of the special categories. And a regular mezzanine is basically a very large mezzanine that doesn't fit into any of the wonderful and fantastic get out of jail free cards that we have available to us with all of these other fantastic mezzanines. Of course, we have the open mezzanine, and I'm going to talk about the specifics of these mezzanines, but I want to get you an idea of these different types of mezzanines that we're going to have in the building. Of course, we have a closed mezzanine. So the open mezzanine is we're open to the area of the building. I can see below. That's an open mezzanine. A closed mezzanine means we put walls up on that mezzanine so that we can have a lunchroom or a boardroom or something like that, and we can't see below. So that we consider a closed mezzanine. We have service space mezzanines, generally a lot of building services. So we've got people going up there to maintain certain types of building services. And there's another mezzanine that I call the ILO Mezzanine. It's sort of a name I sort of created. But when we go through it, there's some specific criteria. But generally speaking, it's an industrial low occupant load mezzanine. And we're going to go through those particular items. And our last one that I'm going to talk about is a catwalk. The building code talks a lot about catwalks. When you're in industrial buildings, you look up, you see these catwalks, or they could be low. But how do we deal with these particular catwalks when we're looking at compliance with mezzanines in the Ontario Building Code? So a regular mezzanine, just like I discussed, it doesn't fit into any of the special categories. Now, a lot of times people think, well, when you're looking through the particular items with the building code, if it's not in the particular category, it's considered a floor. Well, not really. It's a mezzanine. It's always a mezzanine because a mezzanine is a partial floor area. So if you've got any type of partial floor area, it's still a mezzanine. It may not have any of the special exemptions and everything to it, but it is a mezzanine, and it doesn't fit into any of the other criteria. And generally, you treat these like any other floor area, this mezzanine, because it's not fitting into any of those specific get out of jail free cards or special exceptions that allow them to have some special provisions. an open mezzanine. A lot of us have dealt with open mezzanines. And of course, 40% maximum of the open area is located. You can have partitions, but they can only be the height of a guard, and that's 1,070. Library shelves, if you've got a library, there's certain specifics on those. And, you know, a few code cycles ago, they added this provision, because I remember when the code first had these provisions in here, it was somebody would have a mezzanine and it was 40%. And then they put a tiny little closet in the corner, and then someone would say, oh, that's a closed mezzanine. Now you got to meet the other provisions. So the code was actually changed to allow, even though it's an open mezzanine, it allows a 10% max of the open area of which it's located. So, and it can't obstruct visual communication. So the idea is here is that, yes, you could have it in the back corner somewhere, 10%, but you couldn't put it out near the front of that open mezzanine. That would obstruct somebody seeing below. And I think that's the idea of these open mezzanines, is that they're allowing them to be a lot larger, because not only can people see what's going on below, people can hear what's going on below, and people can also smell what's going on below. So I think those senses permit people to find out more quickly when a fire is happening, so that they can get off of that mezzanine and out of the building. And I think that is the reason why open mezzanines are given these special exemptions, which we're going to talk about later, is because of the idea that it's open to below and the senses can notice any issues. Now, you can't superimpose. So if you have one mezzanine on top of another mezzanine, these open mezzanines can't be superimposed. You can't stack them on top of the other. There's actually one other type of mezzanine that does allow superimposing. So this is something to keep note of with regards to the superimposing. So I have a poll question. This is a poll question that Mandy and I seem to get all the time, is that if somebody, and maybe you could give us your experience, if I have an open mezzanine and I have windows installed above the guards, is that okay? Can we still have an open mezzanine in that situation? So you look to the right-hand side, you go to the polls, it says, can you have these windows? Well, no, the room must be open to below, or yes, the window still provide visual communication, or you're not sure. This is something that I imagine a few of us have dealt with a few times in the past. And I think as the poll is going through here, we're starting to see the numbers. You can have it, and 10% aren't sure. So I think when we look at the building code provisions, the building code specifically indicates that it is part of the room, open room. And I know we struggle a lot with this, but in my experience and in my opinion, I would say that windows would not be permitted, in the fact that the mezzanine criteria specifically says that it's in the open room that it is located, with no visual obstructions. And so some people say, well, okay, maybe we can have these windows. But you know what? I think there could be a little bit of controversy on this question. But I think based on my interpretation, it says it's within an open room. And you know, the smell criteria, you know, I can't smell it. I might not hear as well with windows. So I think the safety net of having this open is pretty important. And windows are something that would likely remove that, or not have a big enough impact to ensure the safety of that open mezzanine. Well, thanks very much for those polls that help us understand. I like Will King. Thanks, Will. You've got there that there's a BCC on this. Thank you. That's great. No glass permitted in an open mezzanine. Excellent. I would agree with that. That's good. Thank you. Part 9 is worded a little different than Part 3 on this. Part 9 has not as many mezzanine types. It's worded similarly, but you know, I guess the idea here is that in a Part 9 building, would it be any different? I don't know. It still, to me, looks like it's in the open room that it's located. No, great discussion. Thanks for that poll. The next mezzanine that we typically deal with, of course, is our closed mezzanine. And when you close that mezzanine in, it changes a lot of things. It doesn't allow you to make this. Now, you can always have it bigger. It's nothing to say you can't have it bigger. But of course, we know that when you don't meet these numbers, you get thrown into the different criteria and the more onerous requirements. So when you decide to have either a closed or open mezzanine, you want to meet these provisions if you want them to be as cost effective as possible. And of course, a closed mezzanine is 10% max area of the floor area or the suite of which it's located. So if you've got a building with one suite, you're dealing with floor area, which is typically the story it's on. So that's one criteria. But if you're in a situation where it's multiple suites, then you have to deal with the suite. So it can be 10% of the suite at which it's located. And just like open mezzanines, you cannot superimpose. Well, you could, but if you superimpose, you get kicked out of these special categories and you're going to be treated like a story. You're going to be treated like any other type of floor area. So again, you want to make sure on these particular ones that you do not superimpose, or it's going to trigger you out of these special requirements. Now, those two are the most typical, and we see those happen a lot. But I think the other ones that we're looking at are ones that we don't see as often and that we sometimes struggle with which one to choose, especially if you're in an industrial building. If you're in an industrial building, you're trying to think, well, do I have to choose this ILO mezzanine? Well, of course, there's a few others. Now, this one is only to be used for industrial, but sometimes when you're looking at these different mezzanine types, you're trying to decide which one it is. Now, as a designer, I think you need to try to be clear so that when we go through this, we understand which one that you're choosing. But sometimes they're not clear, and they're just providing a mezzanine and then dealing with the consequences. Now, in this particular type of mezzanine, I call it ILO mezzanine, industrial low occupant load. Now, this one only allows F2 and F3 occupancies. It has a strict occupant load requirement of maximum of 4 people. It can only be permitted in a non-combustible building, and you can't superimpose. So this particular type mezzanine has some strict restrictions, on it that you need to follow. So, and that maximum 4-person occupant load can be the issue. Now, I've been through a few of these projects where the manufacturer or the building owner can't beat the 4 people. It has to be more than 4 people. So they can't fit into this criteria. Everyone would love this one because it lets them away with a lot of things. But the criteria of the occupant load is very important. Right? So when we go through this particular one, you've got to make sure that you provide the correct criteria. Now, again, like our other webinars, what you want to do when you're dealing with these is definitely look at the code itself. And in the top left-hand corner, you'll notice that I have the code references. Those code references will bring you back to the code criteria that can help you understand where we're getting this information. So in this particular type building, if you're going to use an ILO mezzanine and it's in a combustible building, unfortunately, you can't do it, right? So you got to choose another one. Pick one. You got to pick one. Pick your compliance path. So this is a good one, though, for very large non-combustible buildings. They don't have a lot of people going up there. There's a couple of pieces of equipment, or maybe just one person has to be up there, or up to 4, of course. Then these are permitted as a particular category. Service space mezzanines. These mezzanines are a little bit different than the ILO mezzanines in that, of course, they could do the same things. However, when we start getting into the egress, the exiting, and the fire separations, you'll notice that as we pick our mezzanine, you might have different criteria based on egress, vertical fire separations, and whether they're considered a story. So right now you're thinking, well, what's the difference when we're talking about all these types of mezzanines? Well, we're going to get to that as we move through the requirements. But I think what I want to try to do is try to get everybody to understand the different types, understand how they all work. And then when we start comparing them later on, you can think, well, I think I would rather be a service space mezzanine than an ILO mezzanine based on this type of criteria. Now, a service space mezzanine is generally a space that will permit persons to access building services. So it's a mezzanine floor area that allows people to get to building services. It requires enhanced emergency lighting and exit signage. It's going to trigger a fire alarm system in the building code. It requires the service space to be sprinklered unless it has catwalk flooring. Now, maybe this is a good, I don't know if we can do it as a poll, but maybe some chat. What is catwalk flooring? So if you try to Google catwalk flooring, you're going to see a lot of catwalks. I'm thinking the intent is that it's a gridded floor that would allow, you know, sprinkler maybe to go through the bottom, but maybe someone can give us some idea of what catwalk flooring is. This is sometimes where the building code gives us an explanation, but is there really a generic term of what catwalk flooring is? So, but it's a big issue because it's whether or not it needs to be sprinklered or not. No storage. Can't have any storage in this particular one. When we look at some of the other ones, that they may not have a restriction on storage, but this one has a specific restriction on storage. You can't superimpose these particular type of mezzanines. And so as you can see, when we're looking, when you choose a service space mezzanine, you don't see any restrictions on occupant load like the other one, but we do see a restriction on no storage. So there we can look at it and say, okay, I'm trying to choose the right type of mezzanine here, but it's all going to be based on how many people you want in there. Can I have storage? Can I have catwalk flooring? Am I willing to put in a fire alarm system in the building? So this particular type of service space might be quite large. So if it's quite large, you'll see there is no actual size requirements on this. So this may make a better mezzanine to fit in other than the open, or sorry, the closed mezzanine that you might have. So this is an interesting type of mezzanine. And we're going to talk about the criteria moving forward on how we deal with these service space mezzanines. We had a service space mezzanine in the past. I had a cannabis facility, and they had a lot of grow rooms with a whole bunch of hallways up along the entire top of these grow rooms. And it had a lot of servicing in there. And they chose, because of the size of it, they chose it to be a service space. And then, of course, they had to deal with the triggering of the fire alarm and all that other stuff. So there is reasons and times when this is the best one to choose. The catwalks. These are described in the building code, but there's some other criteria. You'll notice that the other one, the service space, didn't talk about periodic maintenance, but this one does. These are used for periodic maintenance. They have a maximum occupant load of 4 persons. This one also has a restriction on storage. These are required to be non-combustible in required non-combustible buildings. And some people will think, well, of course. Well, keep in mind, remember, that when we have a non-combustible building, Section 315 allows combustible components within a non-combustible building. And one of those is combustible mezzanines. So what this is really doing is saying the exemption you normally find about combustible mezzanines in a non-combustible building can't be used for catwalks. So they've got to comply with the building type. They can't use the exception in 315. The interesting thing about catwalks is that when we're talking later on about whether they're considered a story or not, catwalks are not only not considered a story, but they're not considered a mezzanine if you read the requirements. So the issue of superimposing one catwalk above another isn't an issue. So here we can talk about, when we're talking about catwalks, see that there are some benefits in using these, but of course they have to fit the criteria for which they've been built for. So based on these types, I've kind of spent a bit of time looking at these different types. So when we're looking at these different types, what we want to do is then say, well, what does that do? How does that affect things? How does that change things when we're dealing with these considerations? And of course, when you're a regular mezzanine, you don't fit into any of the criteria, you're considered a story. So if it's a 1-story building, you've now kicked yourself into the 2-story requirements. When you fit into any of the other special requirements, then you're not considered a story. So when we're dealing with our 322 articles, in that case, we can see that you have a lot less requirements. It's not as restrictive when we're dealing with the requirements of these. So when you're considered a story, high requirements. Not considered a story, lower requirements. So that's why there's some advantages to fitting into these particular criteria with regards to these special catwalks.
Hey, Gerald, we've got a couple questions just on something we've already touched on. If we could go back for a minute.
Yeah.
I've got a question about, does a service space mezzanine only need to meet audibility requirements for a fire alarm? Therefore, if a fire alarm is not required for the building, the audibility requirement no longer applies.
Definitely a controversial one, and that's a great question. I know I've struggled with this one quite a bit. You know, even with the requirements, and you know, there might be some, you know, some chatter that come out of this, but when you have a building, I've seen it many times where people will put in a building, they'll put in some type of security quasi fire alarm system, and is that permitted? And I've kind of been on the side, and maybe people can have some opinions that'll change my mind, but I've been of the opinion that if the building requires any type of fire alarm system, that it needs to comply with the fire alarm system requirements. And so if you have any type of system that is trying to get people out of the building, or some type of pull station or audibility, it needs to be a fire alarm system. How else can then we apply the audibility and the requirements of the CAN ULC standard? So that's always been my opinion. But yes, that is a bit of an issue. You get a building that does not have a fire alarm system, and then they use the service space, and then now they've got to provide some fire alarm system criteria in that space. For me, and the way I've set this slide up is I say it triggers the fire alarm. They can always choose a different type of mezzanine. It's not to say they can't have this. Either that it has to be considered a story now, or maybe they can work on like a industrial low occupant load mezzanine if they can keep their occupant load down. So there's different ways. So I think it's a matter of where do we slot them in.
There's another question here. When you're going back and talking about the catwalks, question is, can the structure supporting that non-combustible catwalk be combustible?
I would think that generally the code requires anything that's non-combustible to be supported by non-combustible elements. In this case, if I was in a required non-combustible building, it's forcing me to do a non-combustible catwalk. I would think the intent was that it has to be supported by non-combustible, because the building's non-combustible, the catwalk's non-combustible, then I think that they would actually be supported by non-combustible. Of course, if you're in a building that's permitted to be combustible, then you can have a combustible catwalk in any supports. So yeah, that's sort of, is there anything else, Mandy? Or is that the two that dealt with that? So I see here that there's a question about, are the restrictions on catwalks or service platforms? Well, I've put here restrictions.
There's just another one here.
Okay, I put here about catwalks and the restrictions. So I've got here that these are the restrictions that are put in the code. So I think there's no size requirements specifically. There is restrictions on how many people, how much, you can't have any storage. So what I've got in the slides really comes from the building code. So other than these restrictions, I don't see any others. All right, so based on the criteria of these mezzanines, you can see that whether we're considered a story is important. And so when you fit into these special categories, you are not considered a story. So that is going to be advantageous with regards to how you're classifying this as a in your 322 articles for sprinklering, whether it's non-combustible or whether your floor fire separations and what they may be. So vertical fire separations is the next criteria. So once you look in the code, you first have to establish whether it's considered a story or not. Once you consider that, and once you've determined and whether or not that mezzanine you've done is considered a story or not, then we move into the vertical fire separation requirements. The code generally wants, especially if you're a regular floor area or a non-mezzanine or a regular mezzanine, it's saying we've got to put a vertical fire separation at the end of that. We don't want flame smoke to get from the lower level to the higher level or vice versa. We want to contain it. And so do we require these or not is very important as we move through these particular items. So when we're dealing with vertical fire separations, when we're dealing with a regular mezzanine, we've got to have vertical fire separations. They can't be open to below. They just can't do that. That's the idea of these floors, and our regular rules and the standard rules is that we have to have floor areas separated and stories separated from each other. If you're an open mezzanine, of course, the idea is it's open, then you do not need to have it, other than if you're a Group B occupancy. And when I look at these criteria, I think, okay, it's open, but it can't. It needs a vertical fire. Well, it's not open anymore, and I think it pretty much in a Group B occupancy negates the issue of having an open mezzanine. So in a B, but other than that, if you meet the criteria of an open mezzanine, then you don't need to have any vertical fire separations. So of course that keeps us in this issue of having this openness to the area below. When we're dealing with a closed mezzanine, then it of course doesn't need a vertical fire separation, but there is two different caveats to that. It indicates that that wall you're using to close it doesn't need to be a fire separation, right? It could be just a way to close it off. However, if it's more than 500 meters square, or again, if it contains a B, then that must be a vertical fire separation, not just a wall. All right, so this is the criteria that we're now starting to see when I've picked my type of mezzanine. Now we're going into the requirements and how they apply to these specific type of mezzanines. And a vertical fire separation is always a controversial one. Any designer or owner always loves to have this openness. But as we work through this criteria, the only way that they can't have that is if they fit into one of these criteria, of course, and the open is the best. And if they don't want to pay for a fire rated wall, then they need the closed and they don't go over those milestones. When we're dealing with the industrial low occupant load, the industrial with a minimum 4 people in non-combustible buildings, then vertical fire separations are not permitted in those particular cases. And then if I move over to catwalks and elevated platforms, of course, they don't require it either. They're not considered a mezzanine. They're not considered a story, or it might be controversial when we discuss this, but I've struggled with this for many years, is that they're not really a floor area. They're really not meant to be always occupied. And this might get some good discussion in the group on these catwalks. But the idea, of course, of a catwalk is that they aren't closed in. They're open. People can see around, and really maximum 4 people, no storage, and you're just getting up to that service platform in order to fix that piece of equipment, whether it's a conveyor belt. We see a lot of these recently. I've seen a lot of these in these large storage facilities that we're sealing for sand and fertilizer, where they're having these large conveyor belts really high up in the building. And these catwalks are a way for, essentially, if something gets jammed, something doesn't work, they're going to send one guy up there to fix it and come back down. When we're dealing with the surface space mezzanines, there is no exceptions for vertical fire separations. So if somebody chooses to have the service space mezzanine, there is no exception to the vertical fire separation. So in that case, they're still going to have to provide those required fire separations. So this might say to someone, well, I don't want that. Well, then you can't choose it. You need to fit into the catwalk. Well, I have more than 4 people. Well, here's the crux of the problem we have. You need to choose one. You need to restrict the occupant load in order to fit into the catwalk provisions. But if you don't want an occupant load maximum, then we can go into the service space, but then you need to provide all these enhanced life safety issues, like we've just discussed, the fire alarm issues and the fire separations, so on and so forth. I think the idea of the service space, really, when I can see and I can look at these requirements, I see it being really an area that has high life safety issues because there's no occupant load restrictions on those. So as we go through the egress, you may find that there's some different advantages through that. I think if somebody chooses a service space mezzanine, then there's a lot of additional requirements, so it's no big deal. Go ahead, Maddie.
Gerald, Nicole's got a question. Have you ever heard the term interstitial space being used? I have not.
I have not either. I'm not sure what they're getting at with that particular comment. If there's anybody else that has some thoughts on that, but I think sometimes we're going to get a lot of different, but I think it comes down to the code. Like, I think you got to look at the code. What does the code tell us? And really do our best to try to, use the terms that are in there. I really don't see how that changes any of the factors here, other than maybe if it clarifies a specific issue. But I think they need to choose a mezzanine type. And when we get into these industrial mezzanines, especially the ILO mezzanines, the service space and the catwalks, it's like, which one are you choosing? And a lot of times they won't tell you, but they're just designing the building. And I think a good designer will. They'll say, I'm using this particular code reference, this sentence that would allow us to do that. So we've got a comment in here. Interstitial spaces are service spaces often found in hospitals. So I don't know how that would change things. I still think you would need to pick a space. Maybe it fits more into the service space. In a hospital, you're already going to likely be sprinklered. You're already going to have a fire alarm system in that particular building. You're already going to have fire separations. So I imagine you're going to be fitting into this service space mezzanine would likely be the place that you would fit. I think when I get into issues, I know I had a large fertilizer plant and they wanted it to be a service space. But the problem with that is they couldn't meet all the criteria. They didn't want a fire alarm system. And, you know, there was a bit of back and forth on whether a full fire alarm was required, just like we talked about. But, you know, understanding the different categories, they got to pick one or the other. If this was in a farm building, then, of course, none of this applies. That's an easy answer. But, you know, even in some of these large barns that I'm dealing with recently, I think large cattle barns and pork facilities, I've talked to a few building officials about it, is that they're going to have mezzanines in farm buildings. The problem with it is that the farm building code does not talk about farm mezzanines. You really need to deal with just maximum travel distances, whether they're on a second story or first, but really it's not articulated, so it can be a lot more difficult. And as we move into our egress section, I thought we would just have some good discussion about exits from mezzanines. And if you go to the right-hand side, we have another poll here. And of course, the poll indicates, you know, my question and the answers. If a mezzanine requires a vertical fire separation, does it automatically require an exit? And so we've got a yes, we've got a no, and we've got a not sure. And so this is what we're going to discuss moving forward, is dealing with the means of egress off of exits, which can get a little bit crazy, and not everyone's the same. And I think this is where you want to be careful, because if you get into these mezzanines, you have to be careful. I've always thought of egress and exit. You don't want to say something is more important than others in the code, but I would say that egress and exiting is definitely an item in the building code that you do not want to mess around with. It is a very important life safety item. The idea of being able to get people out of buildings quickly in accordance with the building code is very important. And with regards to mezzanines, you have to be very careful on that. And of course, I've got here, you know, we're getting around 55% of people are saying, yes, if I need a vertical fire separation, I automatically need an exit. I've got 25% no, and I've got 20% not sure. Now, many of you may not have your code right in front of you, so you're not able, you know, I'm catching you right off the top here this morning early to see if I can catch you in something, and we never make code decisions this way, but at least it gets us the idea and the juices flowing. So the exit requirements are very important. We want to make sure that we, of course, get those correctly. Now, as you're starting to see, as we're moving through the flow of how mezzanines work, in order for me to determine whether I need exit and my means of egress, I first need to know whether it's considered a story. Once I know whether it's considered a story, then I need to then consider, do I need a vertical fire separation? Once I've determined whether I need a vertical fire separation, then I apply the means of egress provisions. And this is the path you have to follow. And that's why I was saying at the beginning that the one depends on the other. You have to follow those 3 steps in order to get to the right answer. So the answer to this particular poll is no. It does not automatically require an exit if it has a vertical fire separation. It really depends. A lot of the times it does, but not always. Isn't that the best answer? But so as we go through these particular slides on means of egress, I want to talk about the whole path. we look at the definition of means of egress, it includes the access to exit, and it includes, of course, the exit itself. So I break in my particular slides and the building code, it breaks it down into those two different ways. The access to the exit is 3.3 of the building code. That's how do I get throughout the building to get to the exit. And then 3.4 is the exit of actually getting outside the building. So when we look at mezzanines, we have to look at both. We have to look at the access to the exits, and we have to look at the exits. Now, when we're looking at a closed mezzanine, and so these are the ideas that I've got here on the slide, is that I've got it broken down by mezzanine type, and you can start to see where the advantages to having certain types of mezzanines are. And in this particular case, I have a closed mezzanine, and I look at it and I said, okay, I've done my homework. I've determined that this is a closed mezzanine, and then I need to then determine whether I need a vertical fire separation. Well, if a vertical fire separation is not required, then we do not need an exit. So that means we just need to be able to get egress to the floor below, not an exit. You don't need to get directly outside off of this. That's the key when we're determining these types of mezzanine egress methods, is do I need an exit or can I just get to the floor below? And in this particular case, if we go through the scenario, no vertical fire separation, it's not required. However, if the vertical fire separation is required, you can't automatically assume that you do need an exit. Then there is some occupant load, size, and travel distance criteria. I haven't particularly articulated this. Of course, I think it's 60 persons, 200 square meters, I think 25 meters travel distance. It's that typical egress chart. And the one thing you got to remember is, where do I find this? Well, it's interesting. It's hidden in there, but it's in the code. And when we talk about this specific issue, when you meet the criteria and you're less than the criteria, no exits required. But if you're larger than that, then you need to meet anything else that you would need to meet for a floor area. So that would mean, possibly one exit, but two exits. So keeping your mezzanine smaller may negate the requirement of a full-fledged exit on a closed mezzanine. When we're dealing with egress off of a closed mezzanine, we also look at egress. So this is not necessarily getting us directly outside. We've looked at that. Say we look at it, we say, well, we don't need any exits. We still need to deal with egress. And of course, if the exit requirements say you need one exit, well, that's the best form of egress. The egress will take you right out. So if you require vertical fire separation in a closed mezzanine, essentially egress is as per a floor area. Travel distance issues, issues of size and occupant load, you're going to meet it. If the vertical separation is not required, it's going to have that same occupant load, size, and travel distance criteria. If you're less than the required, you need one egress facility. If you're over that, you're going to need two or more, depending on how large you are. So you got to kind of really look at how big this particular mezzanine is to apply the egress and exiting requirements. So one thing to keep in mind is that when you have a particular, if something's considered a story, and I got a question up here which I just noticed, Mandy, that might be applicable, is that when it's considered a story, it's still a mezzanine, right? It's still a mezzanine. It never stopped being a mezzanine. So the mezzanine requirements apply, but it's considered a story. It's required to have a vertical fire separation and whatnot. So I think that's one criteria, is that a mezzanine doesn't stop being a mezzanine when it fits into one of these criteria.
There's another comment here. So it means I can have a 3,000 square meter interconnected floor in a 2-story sprinklered mall, according to 3282. Can I consider it a mezzanine? So I think that's along the same lines of what you just said there.
Yeah, like if you meet the mezzanine criteria, then you're considered a mezzanine. And whether or not you meet the size and occupant load criteria, that's how it's going to apply any of the other requirements based on that. So it's always a mezzanine. It's whether it's considered a story, whether it needs a vertical fire separation, is then going to throw into the requirements of means of egress. So when we're dealing with our open mezzanines, our ILO, our industrial low occupant load, and our catwalks, there's no vertical fire separation required. So there's no exits required from these particular mezzanines. So as long as you meet the criteria that fits you in those particular box, then you do not require exits. Now, of course, you're still going to need egress, and essentially you always get egress anyways because somebody wants to get on them, but whether it's code complying sometimes can be the issue. And of course, when we're dealing with the open and the ILO and the catwalks, means of egress is done essentially the same as the last one. The vertical fire separations are not required for these. If you meet the occupant load size and travel distance criteria, then you need only one. But if you go over top of that criteria, you're going to need 2 sets of stairs off of that mezzanine, and you might need 3 depending on the travel distance requirements. So it comes back to, again, like we discussed, it's the vertical fire separation. Is it required or not? When we're dealing with the service space mezzanines, very specific criteria for this particular one here. And the code articulates that exits are required with a maximum travel distance of 50 meters. So if you choose this service space mezzanine, you need to ensure that within 50 meters, you're at an exit. It also goes on to say that you can't have direct access to the exit. You'll have to have some type of vestibule prior to going into the exit. The idea is there's a lot of services in here, electrical short, something I imagine. They don't want smoke moving directly into the exit. So if they choose a service space mezzanine, they need to meet the requirements of this maximum travel distance. It also has specific egress requirements in 3313 sentence 7 that says if you have you need the vertical fire separation. We've determined that. Based on the size and travel distance criteria, you're either going to need 1 egress facility or 2. So these service space mezzanines do have a very specific set of criteria based on that. And the last item I wanted to sort of talk about before we get into some question periods is ladders. And it's always a question on when we have these particular platforms, and especially in industrial buildings, can I use a ladder? And it's actually one of the code references I'm glad I had to look up and put on a slide because I always have a hard time finding it. But 33113.2 indicates that we're allowed to have access for ladders. They're permitted for egress if it's occasional use for service machinery and equipment and industrial occupancies. And so that's why up on the left-hand side, I have provisions related to the industrial ILO mezzanines, service-based mezzanines, and catwalks. So in these particular cases, you could have ladder access instead of a full compliant stair system to those particular areas of the building.
We have had a few of those lately, actually.
We have.
Not that uncommon.
No, and I think, occasional use, right? They're occasionally going up there to use these. If there's a particular mezzanine that, for instance, the ILO mezzanine, well, it allows industrial less than 4 people, but it doesn't say for occasional use. So if you look at that by itself, you'll say, I need a full ladder. They would need to then provide information to say this is only for occasional use, whether you make them sign it or that's clear on the plans. I think if you use the ladder, it has to be sort of detailed for this occasional use. Now, catwalks already talk about occasional use to be a catwalk, so that's pretty much okay. But you just want to make sure that when you're using it, it's for occasional use.
You've talked a lot about the vertical fire separations. What about the requirement for horizontal fire separations or fire resistance ratings for the mezzanine floors?
Yeah, so I think when we're trying to determine whether it's considered a story or not, that doesn't necessarily say it doesn't stop being a mezzanine, as I said before. When you look in your 322 articles, it will give a specific provision for mezzanines. So it'll say floors need to be rated 1 hour, mezzanines need to be X. So I think you need to provide the mezzanine requirements to these, even to the regular mezzanines, because they're still a mezzanine. They meet the definition of a mezzanine in the code, so you would apply the mezzanine requirements in the 322 article. So that completes our general discussion on mezzanines today, and that's actually quite good. We went an hour. With regards to the regular, we're going to go on to some questions. So Mandy's going to, while I sort of go through this last bit of stuff, Mandy's going to be compiling some of the questions we may not have got to, and then we'll start discussing some of those specific questions that you may have on mezzanines, and so we can have a discussion on them. Definitely, as we're going through the questions, give us your input in the chat. I'll give you my input. Mandy will all give our input, and we'll have some good discussions on some of the things that you maybe think that we didn't clarify that you want to have a discussion on today. That would be fantastic. So get that, definitely think about that, and we'll give Mandy some time. What topic are you most interested in? More in the chat, if you can put it in the chat. We record the chat. Moving forward for our subscription, we have a lot of great topics, but we want more topics from you. I've been in some discussions with a couple of sort of subject matter experts to sort of partner on for some of those webinars coming up soon, later on in the year. So I'll be working through those, but we're definitely interested in what you want to know about. Essentially, we want to focus on code compliance and building code items. But if you have some ideas, put it in the chat as we go through. Just a recap on what we're doing moving forward: 14 training sessions, $495. Next 7 months, every 2 weeks, we're going to have a Wednesday webinar day where we're going to take an hour and we're going to discuss code topics. Easy way to get your CPDB points, and it's a great way to keep your code juices going. Keep in mind, like some of us, we might get a mezzanine once a year. And how are you going to get exceptional at these if you get one project a year? Well, how is by us constantly talking about it. And so I think we really want to be part of your team. We really want to be here to help you, to give you the confidence when you're going through these items and understanding based on sort of what we've discussed in these webinars. So that's what we want to do. We all know that confidence is important, and understanding the material is critical. So let's all work together in order to get there where we want to be. These are the topics that we're going to be releasing moving forward. We have a few other slots that we might be fitting some more items in. So when we're going through these, the next two, of course, I have on the next slides. But these are topics that I see as hot topics moving forward. There may be others, and you know what? We might be doing some other webinars based on some of this information. So please sign up. Let's talk about this stuff, and let's keep moving forward. This is what you get: 7 weeks of bi-weekly courses, 21 hours of technical training, unlimited replays, personal PDFs of each class, CPDP points, and certificates of completion. Larger municipalities, we've already started working with a couple of larger municipalities, and then we have applied some bulk rates. So if you have a large group of people and you want to talk about that, please email us. We'll definitely work with you. We want you part of the group, and we want to keep having you as part of these discussions. We really appreciate the input. Our next webinar is going to be on truss bracing and roof systems. We're going to be talking a lot about the TPIC guidelines and permanent bracing in buildings. Engineered floor systems is going to be following up on that on June 24th, where we're going to talk about the requirements of layouts, the different requirements of engineering, the CCMC reports, so on and so forth. So we're going to have a good discussion on engineered floor systems. What we do at RSM, well, we do a lot of plans examination, inspections, mentorships, and training workshops. Any municipality, if you're looking for some expertise, some help, some support, we can help you as part of your team. We can provide some senior building officials to do some plans examination to help you with that large project. We can provide inspections if you have some coverage issues and you need some help, or you have some larger projects that you would like to have our experienced inspection team work with. And of course, mentorship of young building officials or old that are changing careers, we help with that. And then once we get back, we also do our in-class workshops. So this is what we do. Please reach out to us anytime. Appoint us to your team. We're there to help. We do our job, we do these presentations. We really work hard in order to get you the best information that we know how. However, based on authorities having jurisdiction, they are the ones that interpret the code. So if you're a designer or engineer, please make sure that if any of these topics that you talk about with the municipality to ensure that they have the similar interpretation. If you're a building official, make sure you talk to your CBO and supervisor, because they are the ones that are going to be creating a comprehensive and a consistent approach for your municipality. So make sure it falls in line with that. Our opinions are here based on providing discussion. However, you want to make sure that you talk to the right people and satisfy yourself that the code provisions are being applied to that building. And now what we'll do is we'll start the question and answer period. Last webinar, we went for quite a long time on our question and answer period. So we definitely love to have people stay. If you want to give some input and want to hear some of the questions, or you have a question you're trying to see what our thoughts are on it, please stay. And anyone else, make sure you sign up on the offers tab on the right-hand side. You'll notice that we've got our offer tab that'll take you directly to our website, so you can sign up, because we really want to see you in 2 weeks. I'm really hoping we can get most of you out for our subscription-based service to continue these webinars on a bi-weekly basis. So please sign up for that. And what do you think, Manny? Do you need more time? Should I ramble on for a little bit more, or do you have some questions that are ready?
Yeah, I'm good. There still seems to be a lot of questions based on if a vertical fire separation is required. Where'd it go here? Fell off my page. Vertical separation is required. Is it automatically a story, or can it still be considered a mezzanine? So still some confusion. It's always a mezzanine, but is it considered a story or not based on vertical fire separation?
So I think you first look at it, is it a story? And when you're going through kind of the way we set up the slide, so whenever you determine that it's a story, then you need to look at whether or not it's considered, you need to have a vertical fire separation. So whether it's considered a story does not, I'd have to go through the scenarios, but I don't think you want to look at it that way. You want to look at it, is it a story? I go through that criteria. Then I go to the next part. Does it require vertical fire separation? And as you can see through the scenarios that we talked about, some of those mezzanines do, and some of them do not. For instance, it's a catwalk. It does not, it's not a story. It's not considered a story. It's stayed a mezzanine, and it doesn't need a vertical fire separation. If I'm an industrial low occupant load, I'm not considered a story. I do not need a vertical fire separation. The scenario, I'd have to go back through the slides, but I think you really want to look at each particular one separately and go through the steps in that order, not just assume that because it's a story, it needs to have a vertical fire separation.
Okay. If a mezzanine is considered a service space, shall comply with 32119 strictly. So it must be sprinklered even if the building doesn't need to be sprinklered. So 3211 sentence 9.
Yes. So that's the requirements of the service space mezzanine. And it indicates that that service space needs to be sprinklered unless it has catwalk flooring. And we just talked about what is catwalk flooring. I think the idea is it's a grid, an open grid system, but that's definitely, you're right. It needs to meet the strict criteria in a service space mezzanine, which is described in 3211 sentence 9, I believe, as they described in that question.
Now, and would you apply that similarly to like you did the fire alarm system?
Well, I think if you look at the requirements, it says that the service space must be sprinklered, but the issue of the fire alarm indicates, and it is tough, I know a couple people brought it up, it talks about the audibility requirements for a fire alarm, that you need to be able to hear it in the service space. So does that mean you have to force a fire alarm on the entire building? I have taken the opinion that it does. I don't know how you can, how can you apply the audibility requirements to the service space without having a fire alarm? So, but that is a bit of controversial because it doesn't specifically say you need a fire alarm. It says that you need to meet the audibility requirements of a fire alarm. So that's where you might get the differences of opinion.
Have you ever had a situation, Gerald, where a mezzanine is not considered a floor, requires vertical fire separation, and is fire rating? where mezzanine is not considered a floor, requires vertical fire separation, and it's a fire rating. That's a private comment. Can you?
Yeah, maybe. So it's considered it's a mezzanine because we're talking about mezzanines, and it's considered a story. Is that right?
I believe so. I don't think so. No, where it's not considered a story.
So it's a mezzanine. It's not considered a story. It fits one of the criteria of the mezzanines that we're looking at, and does not need a vertical fire separation.
It does need a vertical fire separation.
Yeah, we might have to maybe look at that one in private. I'm having a hard time sort of following that through, but I think
Yeah.
I think what we do is if you're dealing with these mezzanines, I think to try to and I'm not suggesting you're jumping around a bit, but what I always look at it is I always have to go back to step one. I always have to go through it. I don't try to go right to the end of how many exits or egress or vertical fire separations. If you think about mezzanines from the start, is it considered a story? Yes or no? Do I need a vertical fire separation? Yes or no? Do I need an exit? Yes or no? How many egress do I need? So I think if you follow that strictly in that order, you're going to find yourself less likely to make an error when interpreting mezzanines.
Going back to talking about the floor fire separation or fire resistance rating. So 3216 talks about the floor assemblies of mezzanines. 322 article will only ever specify a required fire resistance rating for a mezzanine. 3216 will force the mezzanine floor to be constructed as a fire separation in accordance to 322. When the mezzanine is required to be considered a story for building height. So just a comment follow-up on what we were talking about previously there.
Very good point. Very good point. So yes, when you get through 322, it does say in that criteria that if it's a mezzanine, it must meet the requirements of a floor. No, good point.
Few comments here. I don't know if anybody has a checklist for mezzanines, but a lot of comments. People would like that. That would be lovely, wouldn't it?
It would be. It would be. I think though that if they follow, reach out to us if you want a PDF copy of some of those flow charts. But really, it's following the flow charts and following that story in the strict order is definitely going to be the best way to do it in order to get the right way.
There's a question here. Can you describe how you calculate 40% area of the suite space before the mezzanine is placed or after?
Yes. If I pull up, I'm going to pull up that slide. Of the poll that might help me describe that. So this particular diagram I have here, when we're trying to determine an open mezzanine, it says that the blue area can't be 40% of the open room in which it's located. So the way I interpret it is that this red section is the room that it's located. It's not located in this purple area because see how I've got it specifically that they've enclosed this other area? So the way I interpret it is that the 40% blue, the red area is the room that it's in, and that blue area is 40% of the red. So if that wall wasn't there, then I guess you could then take the entire floor area because it's still part of that open room. And I think the open room concept is important when we're dealing with that. And it's the aggregate areas. So if they have another mezzanine on the other side, then, if it's 10%, and then they can only have 30%. So it's got to be the aggregate area of the room of which is located.
This is an interesting one. If there's a mezzanine in the basement of a building, which falls under the definition of a story, is it now considered the first story of the building?
Oh, wow.
So I think you have to go back to the definition of first story.
Well, that's interesting. I've never dealt with a mezzanine in a basement specifically myself, but I think, when you're trying to determine the building height, you have to determine what the first story is. So determining the first story is dependent on the floor height, of course, and how far above the ceiling, above grade. I think wow, I would have to go through that one, but that is an interesting question. I think I would likely try to consider that area, whether it's considered a story just within the context of that basement area. And then once I've determined if it's a story or not, then I determine the building height based on where that is. So if it's considered a story within the basement, then I would have to use that mezzanine part as the first story and not the basement, if you get what I mean. I'm just thinking out loud, but that's kind of how I would probably work it backwards that way. But I've never had that specifically happen to me.
Yeah, Chris has got a comment here. Is it a 2-story below grade? So that's where you've got to work it backwards, I think.
That's right. And that's a good one, Chris, because there is specific provisions in there that talk about when you have more than certain stories below grade. So you have to be careful there. But that is a very good question.
Just a comment previously too that they're talking about when they do the update to the farm code, then it will be addressing mezzanines. So that will be interesting.
Nice. No, that's good. We're all anxiously awaiting the farm code. Mezzanines are difficult, and they're starting to become very prevalent in farm buildings, especially when you have these large operations that have showrooms and boardrooms at the top that show off all of their prize cattle or pigs or sheep or water buffalo or whatever they have. So we're being very much stretched on that. I typically apply the maximum travel distance requirements. So if they're at the top of the mezzanine at the back corner, I don't necessarily say they need an exit because I don't see that compliance path in the farm code, but I want to make sure that they don't have to go more than the requirement of travel distance to get outside the building.
So talking about travel distances, there's a couple questions here. Can you go over where to measure travel distances for means of egress? So where some scenarios measure from the room and others go to the top of egress from the mezzanine.
Yeah, I didn't dig deep into that, but yes, it all depends on how many egress or exits are out of the room of which it's located. So in this particular diagram that I have up here, if I turn the whiteboard on here, you can see if I don't show a stair on this particular one, which I guess, but say they had a stair down to below to this particular floor area here, and that's one egress point. And so it depends on how many egress or ways to get out of the room of which it's located. You can see right here we have one way to get out of the room, which of course, say we have another exit back here that gets us out. And then if there's only one way out, then you have to measure it all the way from the furthest point. If there's two ways out, so say they add another door here, then you need to measure it from the top of the egress facility. So it really, when you go through 3315, it's going to talk about how you measure that travel distance. And the easier you can get out of that room below, the longer the travel distance that you can have.
Okay. More on egress. OBC 33113 refers only to the slip resistance requirements of 3461. This excludes the visual contrast at the leading edge of treads and landings. Does not make sense to me for an assembly occupancy. You run into this, Gerald?
I haven't, but yeah, an assembly occupancy, mezzanine, ladder. Yeah, I don't have much experience in that particular section.
Steve had a comment previous to that, but this may be a follow-up to it. With regards to the means of egress from an open mezzanine in a group A2 suite use, do the tread and landing edges require... Oh, sorry, Steve. He had double looped on his question. I was getting to you.
I think definitely in an egress situation, whether it's a standard egress or exiting, you've got to have the contrasting requirements for the stairs. Now for the ladder, you know, if it's allowed to have a ladder, it doesn't meet a lot of their code or egress or exit requirements. So having a contrast, I don't think it's as important because it's only for occasional use. So it's only for a maintenance person. So less likelihood that someone's going to trip or fall.
Pavel's got a question, and you might need to elaborate, Pavel. Side question: how to specify smoke separation for walls? So is that in relation to the fire resistance rating, perhaps?
So in the building code, only under very specific provisions that ask for only smoke control, or we require fire separations typically when we're dealing with mezzanines, and fire separations stop fire. They don't specifically define in the code stop smoke. Now they inherently stop smoke. And now with the new provisions brought in January, there are some provisions that have been added for smoke dampers and smoke doors in certain situations, but none of those are specific to mezzanines that I know of. So it's strictly a fire separation or not. Now, if it's a zero fire separation for the 0 hour fire resistance rating, that's inherently what it does, is stop smoke. I would just simply have it marked as a unrated fire separation on the plan.
I think that's the most of our questions. However, I did want to loop back to this interstitial space that we were talking about earlier, if you don't mind. I went to that website that Terry had posted. Is that Terry? Yeah. I went to that website. Can I screen share that?
Yeah.
Or whiteboard that somehow?
I'll turn off my whiteboard. Did we say that right? Intrastitial?
I'm not sure, to be honest.
I don't know.
But, I mean, when I look at this, it almost looks like a ceiling space.
Mm-hmm. And of course, and I guess in a hospital, that space can be quite large, and there could be people walking up in there. So I think that, you know, if it's a service space mezzanine, like, is it considered a mezzanine? And I think that question would come up. You know, this interstitial space, you know, it could be just a ceiling space, but in these larger buildings, it could be a space where people are walking up there to fix equipment in that space. Now, is that considered a story? I think that's a very important question. And I think the criteria there fits really well into the service space type provisions. But again, they would have to choose which one. If it was less than 4 people, they may fit into another, like if it's a hospital, they can't use the ILO mezzanine, but you know, these are the questions that need to be asked. But I think that's actually a very good question, because it does confuse the issue. Is that a floor or not a floor, or a mezzanine or not?
Yeah, Jonathan said there's quite a few at Mac in hospitals. McMaster's got some, and elevators stop at these floors. Some are 10 to 14 feet high for mechanical space. So
yeah, so I think it's an important question to ask, and it's got to be dealt with, especially if there's people in that mezzanine. Now, if it's really large and there could be over 4 people, I don't think there's any other way to fit other than the service space mezzanine. So then they have to look at, I need to have 50 meters to an exit. If it's a certain size, I need to have egress to the area below at certain intervals. And they could use, I've seen where they use ladders, right? Because you can use ladders. So every so often, they're going to provide ladders to the space below. And then they have to provide an exit within 50 meters.
All right. That's all I have for questions on the board here, Gerald.
Good stuff. Well, I really appreciate everybody's attendance at these free webinars. It's been fantastic. And I know all of us at the team here, we've worked really hard to deliver the best service and the best webinar that we can to help people step through these items. Thanks for being here with us. Please consider signing up for a subscription service moving forward. Please email, please use the offer tab. Check out our website. We're going to try to keep producing this important and great content moving forward for the rest of 2020. And we'd love to be a part of your Wednesdays. So we'll talk to everybody very, very soon. And thanks again. Signing off, for these sessions.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.